Hi, and welcome. Welcome to this second lecture, the book of Jeremiah, part 2. Thanks for joining. I hope you're enjoying the start. I hope you're finding that Jeremiah is an amazing text with a lot to teach. I think one of the things that is worth bringing out is that there is an origin story to Isaiah. We're going to start with that. I'm sorry, there's an origin story to Jeremiah. And we are going to start with that today. So let's get into that, and then we will get into some special verses that start to answer this very seminal question. What does God have against his people? Why is there friction in the relationship? If we have parties in conflict, what is the source of the conflict? And who's in the right? And who's in the wrong? So in this lecture, we're going to take a look at some of those fundamental issues. What was happening at a national level, that the people of Israel and God were coming into conflict with each other, a conflict that ultimately resolves, well, for lack of a better word, in a national divorce. We'll find that God and the Old Testament nation of Israel and later Judah end up in a divorce. But let's start with Jeremiah's origin story first. Looking at Jeremiah chapter 1, we have this. Starting at verse 1, it says, "These are the words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the priests from the town of Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. The Lord first gave messages to Jeremiah during the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, son of Amon, king of Judah. The Lord's messages continued throughout the reign of King Jehoiakim, Josiah's son, until the 11th year of the reign of King Zedekiah, another of Josiah's sons. In August of that 11th year, the people of Jerusalem were taken away as captives. So Jeremiah he's the prophet when the end comes, when the divorce happens. And perhaps it seems to us now like a long distant event, something that happened in the past, maybe a bump in the road of history's events. But I think we'll find that for the people of God, the Old Testament Jewish people living in the land of Israel, and later the land of Judah, we'll find that this final situation where God pulls the trigger and divorces his own people is, well, it's a shock. Verse 4 says this: "The Lord gave me," Jeremiah, "this message. I knew you," Jeremiah, "before I formed you in your mother's womb. Before you were born, I set you apart and appointed you as my prophet to the nations." What beautiful knowledge to have. For the Lord to speak in such an authoritative way to this young individual. Jeremiah replies in verse 6, "Oh, sovereign Lord, I can't speak for you. I'm too young." The Lord replied, "Don't say I'm too young, for you must go wherever I send you and say whatever I tell you. And don't be afraid of the people, for I will be with you and will protect you. I, the Lord, have spoken." What a beautiful text, speaking about Isaiah's commissioning to office. So we talk today in an institutional sense. Sometimes institutions will appoint a new president, or a nation will elect a new president, or some other official will be called and named and appointed. And here God gives us the typical example of what it means to be called and appointed as a prophet. And so we see here, God gives words that says this: "Before you were born, Jeremiah, I set you apart and appointed you as my prophet to the nations." What an intense revelation of destiny. God determined actions that would come to be even before they came to be. Wow. And then, having informed Jeremiah that he's commissioned as a prophet, he then gives words of encouragement and exhortation and warning to the prophet. And this is very typical of what it means to be a prophet. The Lord says here to Jeremiah, "You must go wherever I send you. You must say whatever I tell you." These are the commissioning, governing ideas from God to Jeremiah. You must go wherever. You must say whatever. Where the whatever and the wherever is governed by God. So Jeremiah, in receiving this commission, stops being his own person. His office has a hold over him. He has a duty to do what God has told him to do, to go where God has told him to go, to say what God has told him to say. Now, I don't know how much of this Jeremiah picks up upon in the early part of his ministry, but with this comes a warning in verse 8. Don't be afraid of the people. Well, that seems a little odd. Why? Why should a prophet have to be afraid of the people he's come to minister to? Now, perhaps you're laughing with me, but it's true. As a young person, it didn't really occur to me that God could ask me to go places where I wouldn't want to go, or say things I wouldn't want to say, or minister to a people I wouldn't want to minister to. Now, with this careful statement, don't be afraid of the people. So first of all, why does God need to tell this to Jeremiah? Well, I think we're going to find out in the rest of this book that Jeremiah is going to have reasons to be afraid of the people he ministers to. And so here the Lord gives him a word of stern warning. Don't be afraid. And yet it's also a word of comfort. He says in the second part of verse 8, "For I will be with you, and I will protect you." For the events in Jeremiah's life that are coming, we can see that this communication from God is a comfort indeed. And then verse 8 finishes with this: "I, the Lord, have spoken." Can it be undone? No. Can Jeremiah negotiate the terms of his office? No. For the Lord has spoken, and he speaks with a sovereign authority that Jeremiah must respect and must obey. Now let's take a moment to look at the schedule of readings for today. We've identified 4 passages that we're going to take a look at. And let me just name them. You can mark them out in the text of your Bible to go through. The first reading, Jeremiah chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. This is the high point of God's declared case against his own people, Israel, the falling nation of Judah. And it's a charge of the people being adulterous and unfaithful. We'll explore in the second reading, which is Jeremiah chapter 4, verses 3 to 18. God says in this passage for the people to plow up the hard ground of their hearts and to put on clothes of mourning and weep with broken hearts. And in this passage, what comes to the forefront is God's revelation that it is the human will and it is the moral enmity of the people of the nation that are to blame for God's court case against the falling nation. The third passage, Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 14 to 22. God is going to talk about how sin leads to slavery for the people doing the sinning. Also, we start to ask ourselves a question about this relationship. If God planted a good vine, how did it become corrupt? How could things go so wrong? How could God's people, governed by God himself, placed in a very fortuitous and pleasant circumstance, how could they find themselves in this tragic circumstance? And then the final reading, Jeremiah chapter 3, verses 1 to 10, explores the idea of sin as a spiritual adultery. Now, the problem here isn't that wicked people don't want God. In one sense, of course, they do. But it's the way they want God. And it's the way they want both God's goodness to them and their own wicked pleasures. God, if you were a God who loved me, why then you would overlook my sin and let me sin and do the things that I want. And the analogy here that God uses to confront his people is, well, we talked about it. It's the case of divorce. It's like one spouse bringing another spouse to court and suing for divorce on grounds of adultery. The unfaithful spouse, it's not that they're completely unhappy with being married. It's that they want to be unmarried, or they want to be married, and they want their sexual license and freedom. And we're going to see that it is these qualities that so typify what it means to be a sinner before God. Then after that, we will take a look and build out using some theology questions from Gerhardus Voss's Reformed Dogmatics. Build out a full systematic picture of why this might be so. All right. Now we come to it. We come to the readings. Jeremiah chapter 4, verses 1 to 2. It's a heartbreaking section. And let me read it. O Israel, says the Lord, if you wanted to return to me, you could. You could throw away your detestable idols and stray away no more. Then, when you swear by my name, saying, as surely as the Lord lives, you could do so with truth, justice, and righteousness. Then you would be a blessing to the nations of the world, and all people would come and praise my name. What a staggering indictment. If you wanted, you could return to me. This is the heartbreaking truth about the relationship between God and the people. The people have fallen into this moral condition where they live contrary to God's desires for them. Now, as a Calvinist, as a Reformed person, I want to note that a lot of my good Christian friends who are not Calvinists will see a passage like this and say, isn't this a passage that makes clear that humankind has a freedom of the will? Haven't we shown and demonstrated that there is a free will, that the people possess it? And I think there's a prima facie case here to support that. Well, wait a minute. You're a Calvinist. How can you say that? Well, I'm acknowledging that I think good faith brothers and sisters who are not Calvinists could read a passage like this and come to that conclusion. Now, as a student of the scriptures, and what we'll see in the further exploration of the book of Jeremiah, is I think there's something exactly the opposite going. Now, oftentimes, the issue is framed as Calvinists are against free will, while non-Calvinists are for free will. I don't think that's the case. Historic confessional Calvinism has never denied that humans possess a faculty of will. The interesting thing that comes to me here is how I see this chapter in light of 40 years of studying the scriptures. O Israel, says the Lord, if you wanted to return to me, you could. Rather than that being a statement, this modern libertarian absolutized freedom of will, I actually think it shows and demonstrates the Calvinist position. If you wanted to return to me, you could. Why don't they? Well, they don't want to. Why don't they want to? Well, they ought to want to, right? Something's broken. Something is broken. Now, what's the broken thing? Is there something broken in the land of Israel? Is there something broken in God, as some modern people accuse? No. The broken thing is, in fact, the people. It is the will of the people that is broken. If you wanted to return to me, you could. But they don't want to. We need to build that out. And we're going to start building that case out. But another important aspect of this passage is this: you would be a blessing to the nations of the world, and all people would come and praise my name. What was God hoping to do with the nation of Israel and Judah? Well, prescriptively, what he reveals in this text is that he wanted to be their God, not only so that he could bless them in the land that he's given to them, but so that they, in being blessed, would light up the world around them, the world in which they lived. All of the nations in their region would look and see, why do we live the lives that we live? But the nation of Israel, the nation of Judah, is different. What do they have? We don't have. What's going on with them that isn't our portion? And then the other statement here: you would be a blessing to the nations of the world, and all people would come and praise my name. This is the fundamental theorem, as it were, for Old Testament Israel. It is a national missionary society. Through following God, through obeying him, through loving him, as they should and ought to do, what? They're meant to draw the rest of the world to them, to God, by their holy, good, right, and just living. But now instead, what do the people, the people of other nations, see? They see that God's special people, the people advertised as belonging to God in a special way, this nation has God as their governor. And what are they doing? They're serving detestable idols. How can this be? Let's go to our next passage. Jeremiah chapter 4, verses 3 to 18. This is what the Lord says to the people of Judah and Jerusalem. Plow up the hard ground of your hearts. Change your hearts before the Lord. Now here it comes. Or my anger will burn like an unquenchable fire because of all your sins. Verse 6 says it this way: flee now, do not delay, for I am bringing terrible destruction upon you from the north. Your towns will lie in ruins with no one living in them anymore. So put on clothes of mourning and weep with broken hearts. For the fierce anger of the Lord is still upon us. Centuries of wicked living, and God's patience has finally worn through. Friends, does it shock you as it shocked me as a young reader of this text to find out that God's patience is not infinite when it comes to sin? We sinners receive such patience and long suffering from God. Sometimes we think the good times will never end and we can sin again and again and again and again, and God is going to pick up the bill. He's going to pay the tab. He's going to wipe the slate clean, and then I'm going to get to sin even more. Verse 18 says this: your own actions have brought this upon you. What has happened to the people? They have acted, and God has responded judicially. Okay, let's look at our next passage, Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 14 to 22. Now here we come to it. This is the statement, the declaration of the grievance. Verse 14, why has Israel become a slave? Why has he been carried away as plunder? Verse 17 says this: you have brought this upon yourselves by rebelling against the Lord your God, even though he was leading you on the way. Sometimes some of Calvinism's more aggressive critics will say something like this: in Calvinism, God has a hatred and a grudge for people. Some people he likes, the elect, but he just hates other people, and they never stood a chance. Well, verse 17 reminds us that God's complaint against humans is always judicial response to sin. You have brought this upon yourselves by rebelling against the Lord your God, even though he was leading you on the way. What's the image here? You're in a journey. God is right there with you, leading you step by step in the way you ought to go. And even so, you walk away from him. I walk away from him. That's the charge. Verse 19 says this: your wickedness will bring its own punishment. Your turning from me will shame you. Verse 20 says this: Long ago, I broke the yoke that oppressed you and tore away the chains of your slavery. But still, you said, I will not serve you. On every hill and under every green tree, you have prostituted yourselves by bowing down to idols. There it is. It's the Lord making this connection. He's linking, he's associating the sinfulness of the people with sexual immorality. There's a movement in my culture today to make sex work regular work. Oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm a baker. Oh, what do you do? I'm a school teacher. Oh, what do you do? Well, I'm in the sex trade. There's an effort to normalize that in my culture. Friends, the culture I live in may normalize it, but God here uses it to paint a picture of shame and reproach. Then he says in verse 22, no amount of soap or lye can make you clean. I still see the stain of your guilt. This is getting deep, and it's getting personal. Let's take a look now at Jeremiah chapter 3, verses 1 to 10. The text says, if a man divorces a woman and she goes and marries someone else, he will not take her back again. For that would surely corrupt the land. But you, Israel, have prostituted yourself with many lovers. So why are you trying to come back to me? Verse 3 says this, you have polluted the land with your prostitution and your wickedness. For you are a brazen prostitute and completely shameless. Ouch. Verse 6. The Lord said to me, Jeremiah, have you seen what fickle Israel has done? Like a wife who commits adultery, Israel has worshipped other gods on every hill and under every tree. I thought, after she has done all this, she will return to me. But she did not return, and her faithless sister, Judah, saw this. That treacherous sister, Judah, had no fear, and now she, too, has left me and given herself to prostitution. Despite all this, her faithless sister, Judah, has never sincerely returned to me. She has only pretended to be sorry. I, the Lord, have spoken. Friends, it is a part of the secular culture in the land that I live in to embrace alternative lifestyles, especially around something broadly called polyamory. Friends, in no uncertain terms, God uses a picture, marital faithfulness. And to folks who suppose that a polyamorous picture in their own lives is a faithful picture of God's love for his nation, he says here that it is morally detestable to him. So God's accusation is that the people have sinned against him, and he has likened it to a divorce case, which a man and a woman are at odds because one of them, while still perhaps desiring the benefits of the marriage, wants their freedom to engage in intimate acts with whomever, whenever, and however. And who is the spouse that has any right to object? Friends, we hear that today in my culture. I'm free to do what I want, with who I want, when I want, and where I want. And who are you to tell me otherwise? Friends, I'm nobody to tell you. But I believe there is a God in heaven who has something to say about the matter. Okay, friends. Now we have to start asking for reasons why. We've read the indictment, spiritual wickedness, adultery at a national level. Now, this is not simply God condemning a nation for its sexual mores. Rather, it's God condemning all of the behaviors, sexual and non-sexual, that are sinful, that are against his desire for the nation. And he compares it, he relates it to a court case between an unfaithful spouse and a wayward spouse. Again, the question is, how can this come to pass? Why are the people so wicked? There are a lot of interesting discussions in theology over the centuries on this topic. We're going to take a look at one line that seeks to understand this. Now, we speak often on this video about Calvinism. I'm a Calvinist, but in fact, perhaps more than being a Calvinist, I'm Augustinian or a monergist. I would have the same views as any Augustinian monergist in the culture today. That's not just Calvinists. It would also be, for example, Lutherans, and even some Augustinian Roman Catholics would share this same anthropological view of why this is happening. Early in the church, after centuries of discussion, the theologian Augustine of Hippo came along and talked about the state of humankind that would explain why people are in such a situation as the nation of Israel finds itself in the Old Testament. And Augustine talks about this fourfold state of humankind, this anthropological model. And of course, speaking in Latin, he talks about 4 different states that people are in. And I will just reference the Latin briefly. He talks about humans being in a state of, originally, a state of posse peccare, posse non peccare. And then after the fall into sin, humans become changed. And in this new situation, in this new status, in this new habitus, in this new scenario, he uses the Latin words non posse, non peccare. We're going to reference Puritan writer Thomas Boston, who later comes and expands upon these 4 states in one of his writings. Now, we're not going to go through the entire doctrine here, but we're just going to talk about enough of it to answer the question from our point of view. Why is this situation like this? Why are the Old Testament people of Israel in rebellion against God? And to do this, we understand from this fourfold state that people have fallen into a desperate condition. Translating, we see that Boston restates the 4 Latin terms from Augustine into a state of primitive integrity, transitioning to a state of entire depravity. And then from that depraved state, sinners who are born again, reconciled through Christ, enter a recovery process that ultimately ends in their happiness. Now, I'm going to talk about those first 2 states here as a means to explain the people of Jeremiah's day. We consider how humankind was created by God originally. We have our first human parents, Adam and Eve. They were created directly by God with no human parents of their own, placed into a garden in a state of what I call untested innocence. And I think of the verse in Genesis chapter 2, verse 25, and it says this, and the man and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed. So things start well, however, they do not remain. And just a chapter later, Genesis chapter 3, the unthinkable happens. By the way, was it unthinkable for you the first time you read it? Were you as surprised as I was? I was shocked the first time I read Genesis 3 to find out that people who were untested and innocent before God could fall into such grievous sin. It's this new state that they've come into, a state that through a means we're going to talk about more, has come to be a state that they and all of their children are born into subsequently. And it's a state that we call total depravity, or under the power of sin. And for an epitomizing description of this, the scriptures give us a beautiful passage. I ask this question all the time for my non-Calvinist, non-monergistic friends. What does it mean to be under the power of sin? And they all tell me that it includes their free will. And then I read this passage with them. Romans chapter 3, starting at verse 9. Paul says, we have already shown that all people, whether Jews or Gentiles, are under the power of sin. Now, what's coming next? Paul's going to tell us what it means to be under the power of sin. And he says this, as the scriptures say, no one is righteous, not even one. No one is truly wise. No one is seeking God. All have turned away. All have become useless. No one does good. Not a single one. Now, what's this main description about? The power of sin here is described as an unwillingness. An unwillingness towards what? The things of God. And to what degree are people affected? Are some people affected and others not? Are some people affected, but they're able to overcome it by exercising their free will? It says this, no one is righteous. How many? Not even one. No one is truly wise. What do you mean, Paul? He says this, no one is seeking God. Where's the line of people under the power of sin who are seeking God? Is it a long line? Paul says this, all have turned away. How many have turned away? All have turned away. All have become what? Useless. No one does good, not a single one. And then it continues. It gets worse, as if it could get worse. It says their talk is foul, like the stench from an open grave. Their tongues are filled with lies. Snake venom drips from their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Then here it comes. They rush to commit murder. Destruction and misery always follows them. They don't know where to find peace. They have no fear of God at all. Does this sound like people who are able, or maybe let's use a different word, people who are willing to remedy the situation they're in with respect to God? Friends, I don't think this text shows that we possess any sort of independent, autonomous, rational, self-legislating, inherently good moral faculty of will. Friends, I think it shows that there is this power that we are under as sinners has such an effect upon our wills that we are unwilling to have any proper fellowship with God. And that there is no remedy to our unwillingness. We are unwilling to be willing. What's broken? Our will. Friends, we're going to take a look now at some text written by a Dutch Calvinist thinker, Gerhardus Voss. This is from his Reformed Dogmatics. And in this text, he puts in a summary form a Calvinistic, monergistic thesis that describes just why sin is so bad, just why the people of Israel in Jeremiah's day are falling into the behaviors they're falling into, despite having every external force pulling them in an opposite way. Now, it's very popular and common today amongst critics of Calvinism or Augustinian monergism in general. It's very common to say, you Calvinists, you monergists are coming with a foreign bias and foreign ideas. You're bringing your extra biblical notions to the text and reading those in rather than letting the text speak for itself. Friends, that's a serious charge. And we who are monergists have to take it seriously and be careful and try to make sure we have an answer for those critics. I can understand why some people might think such a thing. Sometimes it looks like we Calvinists read our Calvinist books and then come with this extra baggage to the party and insist that everyone read the way we think they should read. Friends, I think it's the other way around. I think Augustine and monergism arises organically in the church, in its history. And it's, in fact, some of the more popular modern perspectives that take modern understandings and force them upon the text. We'll have more to say about that in this series. But one of the things that it's helpful to take a look at is to think about, what do we see in the book of Jeremiah and in other books in the scriptures about what it means to be under the power of sin? What is sin? What are we talking about? And Voss says here in his question, what characteristics belong to the scriptural concept of sin? What does it mean to be a sinner or to engage in the act of sinning? Voss answers and says this: sin always has a reference to a law, specifically a law of God. And then he says this: sin is non-conformity to God's law. There we have it. God gives us a standard of behavior. He reveals to us a way that we are expected to live. And then, as we fail to meet that standard, we show that we have fallen into non-compliance with God's law. There's more to it, of course. Voss continues and says this: sin includes also guilt and pollution. What does it mean to be a sinner? Well, there were some early Christians who thought that really there was no change after the fall into sin, and that people after the fall into sin were just as able to choose good as to not choose good. That their faculty of will was hardly affected at all, if at all, by this fall. And one can simply choose to sin or to not sin. Well, Professor Voss introduces a concept here, that sin is not just simply an unaffected human, but sin has its place in humans that are both guilty and polluted. And it goes back to that first sinful act. From that, things were put into motion that affects all of the human race. Okay, fine. Well, what do you mean? What is it about sin that affects us? Well, Professor Voss says it here. Concerning the center, sin resides in the will of man. Now, the entire person, the entire sinner, of course, is under the effects. My body, my heart, my memory, my mind, my identity, all of these things are affected by sin's power. But ultimately, the origin is sinfulness, the will, the human will, is broken. Something has gone wrong with my desires, with the things I want to do, with the acts that come into my mind. Now, here's an important point. Professor Voss says God's law has to do not merely with already actually present persons, but also with representative and ideally present persons. What? Well, the idea here is that in Adam, all have sinned. This is an important part of the doctrine of original sin that we need to talk about from the scriptures to do it justice. But here Professor Voss says it. Not only are you and I sinners because of acts we do ourselves that are sinful, but we are also sinners by virtue of someone representing us has sinned on our behalf. G, thanks for nothing. And so Voss points out originally in Adam, Adam's act determines his status. In other words, Adam had an original integrity and an innocence that he lost when he committed the forbidden act. And so in that case, we can say that Adam became a sinner because of what he did. However, in all of us descending from him, that's not true. We, in fact, become sinners by virtue of the representative act of Adam in the garden. Were you in the garden with Adam? Did you eat that forbidden fruit? No, I was not there. You watching this video, I presume, were not there. And yet, Adam represented us in a public and official way. And so because of this, some people suppose that they are sinners when they are in the act of sinning, and perhaps not sinners when they're not sinning. Sometimes I hear people say this: I do good most of the times. It's only very rarely or on occasion that I fall into bad acts. And it's only when I'm doing those acts that I can be said to be a sinner. Well, friends, Professor Voss here disagrees. In fact, you were a sinner from your first moments of existence, and the sinful acts that you do reflect that and manifest that. So we say that people have a sin nature. And that was pretty intense. And we have a lot more work in Jeremiah to connect the dots. But we're still early in the course and in the survey. Are our critics right when they say that this extra theology is extra baggage that ought not be brought to the biblical text? Or are the Augustinian monergists and Calvinists right when they say that it's this framework that best represents the full counsel of the scriptures? Let's continue on in our course together, shall we? Let's close this lecture with a prayer. Lord God, we tremble at your revelation. The things you tell us in this book of Jeremiah are shocking. They are intense. And Lord, I think if you had not said it, if you had not revealed it in this way, in this text and the other books of the Holy Scriptures, I would have never believed it. And yet there it is. Lord God, help us, aid us, give us your grace, Lord, to overcome this nature that we have, this sinful nature, this wicked, rebellious nature. Bless us, Lord, in our reading and in our studies. Help us to find wholesome fellowship with other believers, Lord. And I pray for special blessings, Lord, for those students who are reading the questions and answers from Voss's Reformed Dogmatics. Please be with them, Lord, to help them in difficult reading of a difficult text. Thank you for being with us, Lord. We praise you and honor you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.